It had been 3 weeks since my sister moved out. The apartment felt hollow without her, a space too large for just one person. Her laugh used to fill the silence, her chatter bouncing off the walls like light in a dark room. Now, it was just me. Me and the relentless hum of the city that seeped in through the cracks in the windows. She had gotten married, of course. That's what people did. She left with an excited smile and promises to visit often. But promises were like the breeze, gentle, fleeting, impossible to hold. I didn't blame her. She deserved happiness. I just wished it hadn't left me behind. The first few nights were fine. Quiet, even comforting. I worked late, came home, ate dinner in front of the TV, and went to bed. It was a routine, albeit a monotonous one. But then, as the days stretched into nights, I started noticing the silence wasn't as empty as I thought. It began with faint sounds above me, a soft creak, a muffled shuffle, the kind of noises you attribute to an old building. I didn't think much of it. The apartment above mine had been empty for months, ever since Mrs. Kohler, the retired nurse, had passed away. Her nephew had been handling the property, but as far as I knew, it was still vacant. At least, that's what I thought until I heard the coughing. It was late, past midnight, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to lull myself to sleep. Then it came, raspy and wet, the kind of cough that made your throat itch just hearing it. I froze, phone still clutched in my hand, ears straining. Another cough. This one closer, more pronounced. I sat up, heart thudding. My first thought was someone had broken in. Squatters, maybe. Or worse. But then I remembered, the nephew had mentioned a tenant, someone moving in temporarily, a former doctor, he'd said. An older man. I exhaled, trying to relax. It was just the new neighbor, probably restless or unwell. Nothing sinister about it. But then there was the thud. It wasn't loud, but it had weight to it, like something heavy had been dropped or knocked over. It was followed by another, then another, each sound echoing in the stillness of the night. I stared at the ceiling, my pulse quickening. Maybe I should go check. Introduce myself. See if he needed help. That's what a good neighbor would do, right? But the thought of climbing those stairs, knocking on that door in the dead of night, sent a shiver down my spine. What if he was sick, contagious? Or worse, what if I interrupted something I wasn't meant to see? I stayed in bed, telling myself it was none of my business, that I was imagining things. But as the hours crept by, the sounds didn't stop. The coughing turned to whispers, faint but insistent, like someone talking to themselves. And the thuds, they became rhythmic, almost purposeful. By the time dawn broke, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling with bloodshot eyes, wondering just what kind of man had moved in above me. The next day, I tried to shake off the uneasy night. Lack of sleep can mess with your mind, make you see things, hear things that aren't there, or so I told myself. I needed to snap out of it. A good walk, some fresh air, maybe even cooking something instead of ordering takeout for the third night in a row. I decided to swing by the little corner store near my building. The aisles were narrow and cramped, shelves crammed with everything from canned soup to dusty bottles of soda that probably hadn't been touched in years. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, buzzing in the kind of way that made you feel like you were being watched. As I grabbed a loaf of bread and a carton of eggs, my attention snagged on a man near the meat counter. He was old, ancient, really, with wiry gray hair sticking out from beneath a faded cap. His shoulders were hunched, his frame swallowed by a coat 2 sizes too big. But it wasn't his appearance that caught my eye. It was what he was buying. Chicken heads. A whole bag of them. I stopped mid-aisle, staring as he pointed to the pile in the case, muttering something to the butcher. The man behind the counter nodded, scooping the heads into a thin plastic bag and tying it off. The old man's hands trembled as he took the bag, clutching it tightly like it was something precious. It was odd, sure, but I figured maybe he had a cat or a dog to feed. Some people were thrifty, even resourceful. Still, the image of those pale, lifeless heads, their empty eyes staring through the plastic, clung to me as I paid for my groceries. On my way out, I glanced over my shoulder, watching him shuffle toward the register. He was slow, deliberate, his movements strained like each step hurt. I didn't give it much thought after that. Just another eccentric city dweller. Everyone's got their quirks. But as I approached my building, my heart dropped. There he was. The old man with the chicken heads. He was standing at the front entrance, the plastic bag swinging lightly in his grip. For a moment, I thought he might just be passing by, but then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a key. My stomach tightened. I stopped on the sidewalk, watching as he unlocked the front door and disappeared inside. The logical part of me told myself it made sense. This was the tenant the nephew had mentioned, the former doctor. He wasn't just some random stranger, he lived here now. But logic didn't explain the creeping chill in my chest as I followed him inside, keeping my distance as he climbed the stairs, the bag of chicken heads swaying with each step. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, just moved slowly, methodically, until he disappeared into the apartment above mine. The door closed with a soft click. I stood there in the stairwell for a long time, staring at the spot where he'd been, listening to the faint sounds of movement above. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, darker. And for the first time since my sister moved out, I wished I wasn't alone. The strange noises continued every night, seeping through the ceiling like a whisper in my ears. It was maddening, the muffled coughs, the rhythmic thuds, the occasional sound of something dragging across the floor. I tried to ignore it, telling myself the old man above me was harmless, just a reclusive doctor, likely tending to his own ailments. But something about him gnawed at me. A few days after I saw him at the store, I decided to take a break from the apartment. I grabbed my headphones and went for a long walk, letting the bustle of the city drown out my restless thoughts. By the time I returned, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and orange. As I approached the building, something caught my movement from above. I looked up, shielding my face from the glare of the setting sun. The old man was at his window. At first, I thought he was just looking out, enjoying the evening air, but then I saw his hands. He was holding a bundle of what looked like rags, damp, yellowed, and stained with something dark and viscous. He tossed them out the window. I stepped back as the bundle fell, hitting the pavement with a sickening, wet slap. My breath caught as I stared at the heap, a rancid, sour smell wafting up to meet me. The rags were soaked, dripping with a pale, yellowish liquid that pooled on the ground in a sluggish puddle. My stomach churned. The liquid oozed from the cloth like pus from an infected wound, the acrid stench making my eyes water. "Hey!" I called up before I could stop myself. The old man froze. For a moment, he just stood there, leaning out the window, his face obscured by the shadows of the apartment. Then, slowly, he turned his head, and our eyes met. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were wrong. Sunken and glassy, like they weren't looking at me so much as through me. He didn't say a word, didn't flinch, just stared. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "You can't just throw things out the window." My voice wavered, barely louder than a whisper. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly retreated into the darkness of his apartment, pulling the curtains closed with a sharp, final tug. I stood there for a long moment, staring up at the now dark window, the sickly smell of the rags still clinging to the air around me. Eventually, I forced myself to look down at the pile, trying to suppress the bile rising in my throat. The stains on the rags weren't just yellow. There were streaks of crimson, blood, maybe mixed with oozing fluid. My mind raced with questions. What was he doing up there? Why did he have something so foul? I didn't want to know. But as I turned to head inside, the sounds from the night before echoed in my mind, the rhythmic thuds, the dragging noises. And for the first time, I wondered if they weren't just the sounds of an old man going about his business. I wondered if they were the sounds of something far, far worse. It had been days since I saw the old man toss those sickening rags out the window. The stains on the pavement had dried, but the memory clung to me like a shadow. The sounds from above hadn't stopped either. If anything, they'd gotten worse, louder, more erratic. I wasn't sleeping much. The unease gnawed at me, turning my thoughts into a relentless spiral of paranoia. What was he doing up there? What was all that noise? And those rags, the blood, the pus. It was during this restless haze that my sister called. "Hey, how's my favorite brother doing?" Her voice was bright, warm, like a beacon in the darkness of my mind. I didn't tell her about the noises or the rags or the old man. What was the point? She had her own life now, her new home, her husband. My problems weren't her problems anymore. Instead, I told her I was fine. "Well, I'm coming over," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You need some company." She arrived a couple of hours later, her usual whirlwind of energy filling the apartment. She brought groceries, chattered about her new place, teased me about the state of my kitchen. For a few brief moments, it felt like old times. The tension in my chest eased, the oppressive weight of the past few nights lifting, if only temporarily. We cooked dinner together, laughing as she scolded me for forgetting to buy olive oil. She asked how I'd been, if I was meeting new people, if I thought about moving to a better place. I deflected most of her questions, not wanting to delve into the strange reality I'd been living in. As the evening wore on, I found myself glancing at the ceiling. The noises had been quiet so far, no thuds, no dragging, no muffled whispers. I hoped it would stay that way. After dinner, she lingered for a while, her bright demeanor softening. "You know you can call me, right? If you need anything," she said, her eyes searching mine. "Yeah, I know," I replied, forcing a smile. She stayed a little longer, but eventually she had to leave. She hugged me tightly at the door, promising to visit again soon. I watched her go, her figure disappearing into the night as she walked down the street. The apartment felt empty the moment the door closed behind her, the silence rushing back like a wave. I stood there for a while, staring at the door, wishing I'd told her more. Wishing I'd told her to stay. The sound of a heavy thud above me jolted me back to reality. The noises were back. I glanced up at the ceiling, my heart pounding. The thuds came again, followed by that same dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My sister's visit had been a brief reprieve, a fleeting comfort. But now, the reality of my situation was crashing back down on me, heavier than ever. I locked the door and sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling as the sounds continued, each one pulling me deeper into the growing sense of dread. The old man was up there, and he wasn't alone. I didn't know how I knew that. I just did. I couldn't take it anymore. The noises, the thuds, the whispers, every night it got worse, gnawing at my sanity. My apartment had become a prison, the walls pressing in, the ceiling a constant reminder of the madness happening just above me. I don't know what finally broke me. Maybe it was the way the dragging sound seemed to echo directly over my bed. Or maybe it was the memory of the rags, the sickening, oozing pile he'd thrown from his window. Whatever it was, I found myself standing at his door, fists trembling as I knocked. The hallway was dim, the single bulb flickering overhead. I felt like I was being watched, though the corridor was empty. My knock echoed, sharp and hollow, but no answer came. I knocked again, louder this time. "Mr. Sir? Are you all right in there?" My voice was strained, shaking despite my best effort to sound calm. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to turn away, the door creaked open an inch. He was there. The old man. His pale, waxy face peeked through the crack, one sunken eye staring at me. Up close, he looked even worse than before, skin sagging like it didn't fit his skull, lips cracked and peeling. A faint, sour smell wafted from the opening, making me want to gag. "What do you want?" His voice was low, a guttural rasp that seemed to scrape against my ears. I've been hearing noises. From your apartment. Loud noises. Are you all right? Is something wrong?" He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he opened the door wider and gestured for me to come in. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and run, but curiosity, or maybe sheer stubbornness, kept my feet moving. I stepped inside, the air thick and stifling, carrying a rancid smell that clung to my skin. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb in the corner. The walls were lined with shelves, cluttered with jars of murky liquid and twisted, unrecognizable objects. Papers were scattered across the floor, smeared with stains I didn't want to identify. "Where's the noise coming from?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he shuffled toward a door at the end of the hall, his movements slow and deliberate. The door was heavy, reinforced with thick metal bolts and a padlock that now hung open. He pushed it open, revealing a room beyond. The stench hit me first, thick, acrid, almost suffocating. My stomach lurched, bile rising in my throat as I stepped forward, peering into the gloom. The room was a nightmare. The walls were draped in torn, filthy rags, the fabric crusted with dark stains that glistened in the dim light. Bones littered the floor, some small and splintered, others larger, jagged edges poking out from the grime. They looked fresh, too fresh, like they'd been stripped of flesh only hours ago. In the center of the room, lying on a makeshift bed of stained fabric, was it. I don't have the words to fully describe it, but the image is burned into my mind, clear as day. It was roughly humanoid in shape, but its skin was a pale, mottled gray, slick with some kind of viscous fluid. Its head was featureless, save for a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth that seemed to quiver as it breathed. It had no eyes, no ears, no nose, just that terrible mouth, constantly opening and closing in a grotesque, rhythmic motion. Its arms ended in grotesque outgrowths where its fingers should have been, long, fleshy appendages covered in oozing tumors. The growths twitched and flexed, as though they had minds of their own, grasping at the air. It made a sound, a wet, gurgling rasp that sent ice down my spine. The sound was almost familiar, like the whispers I'd heard through the ceiling. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What is that?" The old man stood beside me, his face expressionless. "It's mine," he said simply, as though that explained anything. "Why? What are you doing? What is that thing?" My voice cracked, hysteria bubbling to the surface. He turned to me, his sunken eyes cold and unfeeling. "It's not for you to understand," he said, his tone flat. "You shouldn't have come here." The creature let out a wet, sucking noise, its malformed limbs twitching violently. I stumbled out of the room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The old man didn't try to stop me. He simply closed the door behind me with a quiet click, sealing the nightmare back inside. I ran out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the cold night air, gasping for breath. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the image of that thing, or the feeling that it had somehow noticed me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest, but the fear clawing at my mind was worse. The creature, the thing, in that room wasn't something natural. It wasn't something I could rationalize or dismiss as a hallucination. I leaned against the wall of the building, my legs trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. My breaths were shallow and ragged, the chill biting at my skin. I was about to bolt entirely, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed place as possible, when I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. Slowly, I turned my head. The old man was there, standing just outside the door to the building. A cigarette dangled from his thin, cracked lips, the tip glowing faintly in the dim light of the street lamp. He looked at me, his sunken eyes half-lidded, his expression unreadable. "You ran," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. "Of course I ran." I snapped, my voice trembling. "What the hell is that thing? Why, what is?" My words caught in my throat, my mind unable to form coherent questions. The old man exhaled a long plume of smoke, watching it dissipate into the cold air. "You shouldn't have come up," he said quietly. "Curiosity, it's dangerous." What is that thing? Why do you have it? Why is it even alive?" He tilted his head slightly, studying me like one might study an insect crawling across a table. Then, To my surprise, he walked closer and sat down on the curb, his movements slow and deliberate. He motioned for me to join him. Against all my better instincts, I sat. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply puffing on his cigarette. The silence stretched, the distant hum of the city the only sound. Finally, he spoke. "It's a disease," he said, his voice distant, as though he were speaking to himself. "Something unnatural. Unseen to science. It doesn't spread like you'd think, not through air, water, or touch. No one really knows how it started, but my grandfather, he was the first." I stared at him, my pulse still racing. "Your grandfather?" He nodded slowly. "He was a farmer. Hardworking, simple. One day, he fell ill. Fever, chills, coughing up blood. The doctors couldn't figure it out. Thought it was some rare infection, or maybe something from the livestock. But it wasn't like any sickness they'd ever seen." He paused, taking another long drag of his cigarette. "It didn't kill him, though. Not like they expected. No, it changed him." A shiver ran down my spine. "Changed him how?" The old man's lips curled into a grim smile. "It didn't let him die. His body rotted, his skin grew pale and sickly, but he didn't die. He couldn't die. And he began to grow. Tumors, outgrowths, strange things that shouldn't be part of a human body. And through it all, he was still alive. Still aware." I felt sick. My stomach churned, and I had to force myself not to retch right there on the curb. "That thing up there, that's your grandfather?" He shook his head. "No. That's something else. A fragment of what he was. You see, a scientist found out about my grandfather. He wanted to study him, find a cure, maybe even harness whatever this disease was for something greater. The experiments, though," he trailed off, staring at the glowing tip of his cigarette. "They didn't work. Not in the way he wanted." I didn't dare ask, but the old man continued anyway. He tried to isolate the disease, replicate it, break it down into something manageable. But the disease, it wasn't just some bacteria or virus. It was alive in a way science couldn't comprehend. And it fought back. The experiments gave birth to things. Things that shouldn't exist. My hands were trembling. "And you're keeping one of those things in your apartment?" He nodded. "It's part of my responsibility. My family has carried this burden for generations. We've kept the pieces contained, hidden away from the world. What you saw, it can't leave that room. If it does," he didn't finish the sentence, but the look in his eyes told me enough. "Why don't you destroy it?" I whispered. He let out a humorless laugh, the sound dry and brittle. "Destroy it? You think we haven't tried? Fire, acid, cutting it to pieces, it always comes back. Always." I stared at him, my chest tightening. "So what do you do?" "Just keep it locked up and hope for the best. That's all I can do," he said simply. "And now, you've seen it. You've involved yourself in something you can't walk away from." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. "I didn't ask for this," I whispered. "No one ever does," he said, stubbing out his cigarette on the curb. "But now that you know, you have a choice. You can leave, forget this ever happened. But if you stay," he stood, looking down at me with those hollow eyes. "If you stay, you'll have to share the burden. And trust me, this burden will break you." With that, he turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone on the curb, the cold night pressing in around me like a shroud. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty street, my mind a whirl of terror and unanswered questions. What had I gotten myself into? And, more importantly, could I ever truly escape it? I sat on the curb, clutching my knees, trying to steady my breathing. The old man's words kept replaying in my head, "The burden will break you." I wanted to believe I could shake this off, call the police, or forget it all and leave, but his hollow eyes told me the truth. I was already caught in this, tangled in a nightmare I couldn't understand. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen, considering calling the cops. What would I even say? Hi, my neighbor is keeping a horrifying creature in his apartment, and I think it's some kind of experiment gone wrong. They'd think I'd lost my mind. But as I hesitated, my thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a deafening crash. It came from above, his apartment. The noise was thunderous, shaking the building, and for a split second, I froze. But then my legs moved on their own, driven by a mix of fear and adrenaline. I bolted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, heart hammering in my chest. When I reached the old man's floor, I saw the door. It was wide open, the heavy metal lock hanging from its hinges like a broken jaw. I hesitated, my breath hitching, but something compelled me forward. I stepped inside, the sour stench from before assaulting my senses immediately. The apartment was dark, save for the faint glow from the cracked door at the end of the hallway, the room where the creature had been kept. I crept forward, my steps tentative, my skin crawling. Then I saw him. The old man. He was lying in the center of the room, his head shattered like a dropped melon, shards of bone and wet, glistening brain matter splattered across the floor. His body was twisted unnaturally, one arm bent backward at an impossible angle. The blood pooled beneath him, dark and thick, seeping into the rags and bones that littered the floor. Above him, the creature loomed. It was even more horrifying than I remembered. Its flesh glistened under the faint light, its eyeless face turned downward as its grotesque fingers, those fleshy, tumor-covered growths, twitched and flexed. Its mouth, jagged and yawning, emitted a low, guttural sound that almost sounded like sobbing. I froze, unable to move, my breath caught in my throat. Then it spoke.
"You don't understand,"
it rasped, its voice wet and hollow, like water pouring through rotted wood.
"He was one of them, one of the ones who did this to me."
I couldn't respond. My legs felt like lead, my mouth dry as sand. The creature shifted slightly, its grotesque limbs quivering.
"They called it progress. They called it science. They wanted to cure death, to play God."
It let out a sound, a terrible, choking wail that made my blood run cold.
"But they lied. They lied, and they made me."
I couldn't tear my eyes away from the old man's shattered body, the way his blood seemed to seep into the creature's pale, glistening skin.
"He kept me locked away,"
it continued, its voice breaking.
"feeding me scraps, keeping me alive because he needed me to suffer. He said it was my penance, my punishment for being wrong."
The creature tilted its head, the gaping maw trembling.
"But I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose this."
It sobbed, a sick, wet sound that echoed in the room.
"Do you know what it's like to never die? To never stop feeling pain? To be trapped in this rotting body?"
I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a loose bone. The sound of it snapping under my weight made the creature's head snap toward me. For a moment, we locked eyes, or at least, I locked onto the empty pits where its eyes should have been. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Its voice dropped, softer now, almost pleading.
"All I wanted was to end it. To end him.
It gestured toward the old man's corpse.
But it's never enough. They made sure of that. There's no end. No peace. Only this."
Tears, if you could call them that, began to streak down its mauled skin, clear liquid mixing with the pus and blood that oozed from its body. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was fear, or pity, or some primal instinct to survive. I turned and ran, bolting from the apartment as fast as my legs would carry me. I could hear its cries behind me, each sob echoing in my ears, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, the door locked and bolted, my back pressed against the cold wood as I gasped for breath. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. "What's your emergency?" the operator asked. There's been a murder," I stammered, my voice shaking. "My neighbor, he's dead. Please, send someone. Hurry." I didn't mention the creature. I couldn't. As I hung up, My gaze drifted to the ceiling, the faint sound of sobbing still echoing in my mind. And then, as if the words were placed there by something beyond me, I whispered, "For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life." But there was no life here. Only death. And something far, far worse.